So introducing our next panelists, and they are very prestigious panelists, and I feel in awe of moderating this session. Angus Armour, who is CEO and MD of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and you can look at everyone's bio that was provided for this session. Each of them are very modest and don't want their whole bios read out and taking up valuable time in the panel. Louise Davidson, who is the CEO of ACSI. So thank you, Louise, for your support of this forum. And Diane Smith-Gander, who is a very well-respected non-executive director and is currently chair of Zipco, obviously one of the newer companies, and a non-executive director of HBF and AGL Energy and Keystart Loans. So join with me welcoming these three panelists to talk about board skills and approach at a board level to ESG. I'm going to start off with Diane and put you on the spot first, Diane. How do you perceive the roles and responsibilities of board directors in the future? And how do directors need to position themselves to succeed in the future? Over to you, Diane.
Thanks very much, Jackie, and it's delightful to be with everybody. I'm here on the lands of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Being a director is not for the faint-hearted, I've got to say, but I don't think the roles and responsibilities per se are changing. It's more about how you discharge those responsibilities. No, the directors have always had the responsibility to ensure the sustainability of the corporation and to make sure that the value is protected, preserved and grows in the future, because that supports the investors and their decision to be a part of the corporation. But it also should ensure that all of the stakeholders receive appropriate attention. I think a director's always needed to have a very inquiring mind, and be able to ask the appropriate question, because really you're sitting as a part-time person, hindsighting what's going on in the organisation, and you're never going to have as much information as management who are there full-time. So the art of the director is to know when you've got enough information to make an appropriate decision. To me, that's the definition of judgment, making good decisions in the absence of completely full information. But I think the world is ever more complex. We know that digitisation is occurring at great pace, that network effects are much more important because of the interconnection between companies and between countries. And we've got a lot of automation occurring. And above all, I think we have changing community expectations. And that's before you even bring into the mix the fact that there's been a global pandemic. So I think directors really need to position themselves as curators of information, and to understand the skills that are needed for them to make these decisions, and particularly know when those skills aren't in the boardroom, and to know how to access those skills, because you can't just sort of completely go on and keep adding to your board and making it sort of larger and larger. You have to have lots of different ways of actually bringing in that expertise. So I think the role and responsibility of the director is always going to be around stewarding the sustainability of the corporation, but it's going to look very different in the way that it's executed.
Thank you, Diane. I think that's a very important point, that the actual responsibility hasn't changed. It's just the context that we're having to apply that. I'd now like to then hand over to Angus for a few comments on the question. I'm a fellow of the Institute Company Directors, and Angus, congratulations on last year for keeping us up to date on what we needed to know around the board table. And you held some amazing virtual sessions from my point of view, as we all learnt to Zoom, we all learnt to engage with our stakeholders in a very different way. But what skills do you feel are important for boards to have to deal with ESG issues? And a point Diane raised that made me think about, if then this questioning of directors, and directors are going to become more questioning, How do they differentiate their role from management? I'm just keen on your view.
Thanks, Jacki. Look, I think it'd be hard to add to what Diane had to say because it was pretty comprehensive. So I might focus on a few attributes and then come back to your question about the board versus management. I think the two most important attributes for a director, either through an ESG lens or any lens, is curiosity and humility. Curiosity because you need to keep asking questions that will help you to understand the position you're in at that moment. And humility, because you need to accept there are many more people in your company, in your economy, who might know more about a subject than you do. And your role really is how do you best marshal those resources to get to the best outcome for your company in the best interests of the company. So it's not about having, as Diane said, and I think it's a great point to emphasize, it's not about having an expert on elements, each element that concerns you on the board. That's simply impractical and also has its own unfortunate dynamic. It's about having a group of people who work well together, who have a necessary level of leadership, humility, and curiosity in their approach. And coming to your question about management, I think what differentiates a great board from an average board is that ability to navigate the line and to understand that the line, in fact, changes depending on circumstance. So in most cases, you're in a fully functioning organization and a point of stability. You're focused on governance process and policy. You're focused on outcomes. You're focused on strategy. But in crisis, a board will step into the management space a little more aggressively than they would in normal circumstances. So that line shifts back and forth. That's a judgment, and the board needs to have good consensus about when to make that shift, and a good relationship with management so that when they make that shift, the intent is understood, and it remains still a very collegial working environment.
Thank you, Angus. And I think that point that you and Diane are raising is about the judgment. And you then also emphasize this relationship. I guess when times are good, investing in the relationship so your intent is not misunderstood when you're actually in crisis, and having to swing more to a tighter governance model is an important point that you've emphasised there. I would like to also say to all our audience that we will be taking question and answers towards the end of the panel. So if you've got any questions you'd like me to pose to the panellists, please type them in the chat. Now, Louise, I've been on the receiving end of some questions when I was in my executive life from you and your organisation. And I think you do, as an organisation, work very hard to help directors and executives understand the societal shifts that are happening and investor relations and the investor connection to that. My question to you is, what has changed in the last 5 years from your perspective in relation to managing ESG issues? And has expectations about the accountability of directors shifted in recent years from investors such as the superannuation industry?
Thanks, Jacki, and hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I do want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people today. So the last 5 years, I mean, I think we have seen a shift in respect to the extent to which ESG is now seen as a mainstream part of the investment process. Our members, ACSI's members, are long-term investors and have had an interest in ESG and talking to companies about how they're managing ESG risk for a long time now. But I think that it has certainly grown in prominence globally, and you can now see that a very large proportion of institutionally managed assets around the world now have ESG embedded in their investment process. And so has that changed the conversation with directors or director accountability? I mean, directors have always had the same level of accountability, I think. So I don't think that it has changed that. I think it has perhaps it's broadened the conversation, the topics of conversation that take place now between investors and directors. And many directors that I speak to welcome that, because instead of only having a focus on, the short-term financial, like that quarter's finances or that 6 months finances, investors are now talking about longer-term issues. And given that directors are also very focused on that long-term sustainability, as Diane put it earlier, I think that is has been a welcome change, and one that is, really it's important for company directors to understand that investors are interested in how long the company is going to be sustainable, how well it's managing climate change issues, how well it's managing its social license to operate, and all of those factors that go into driving long-term sustainability for a company.
Thanks, Louise. And I think your emphasis on the long-term nature of investors raises a point, though, doesn't it, that in a mix of a company and their investment, there may be short-term investors. So how you balance that in terms of how you're managing the risk, but also managing your strategy. And I mean, I used to love the conversations that asked us how we were making the money rather than just the money that was being made, because I think it then gave you more purpose as a leader, and the same would be for directors, about what your company is about and what you're really, your purpose. And there's a session on purpose and culture tomorrow, which I think is a really important point. But your view about, Diane, could I ask you, because I think you have had a wealth of experience of balancing this long-term versus short-term view.
Well, I think
how do you do that?
Well, actually, I wanted to link onto something that Louise said, because you could probably see me nodding my head like crazy to everything she said. And, as a non-executive director, and in some places I chair the people committee, a couple of times a year we go round, the chairman and myself, and we meet all of our investors, and we meet the proxy advisors who, advise their investors. And of course, ACSI has a, huge role there. But certainly over the last 5 years, the level of questioning has really changed a lot. And the expectation is that directors will be 2, 3, 4 levels deeper today than we were expected to be on ESG issues. And, which ones are focused on will depend on the nature of the company, but certainly everybody is expected to really understand TCFD and really be able to dig into how the company is going about understanding its ability to present appropriate information for the market to understand reaction, climate risks, both in terms of those that are direct to the company, but those risks that you will be exposed to second, third, and fourth order. And so I've really noticed the difference there. The other thing that I think is a different expectation is that, as Angus said, when something goes wrong, the expectation is not just that you will hear from management about their response, but that you will hear directly from the board, through the chairman, about what the board's response and what the company's response is. And I think that's really showing some nuance in people's understanding of the two different roles. And when a board missteps and doesn't respond appropriately to issues of ESG in the company, I think that actually that poor response can be even more damaging than the initial thing that may have caused the issue. And I think if you cast back to the issues of Bo Pahari's promotion at AMP, and when that came to light, how the board responded, I think was actually caused more issues for the company than the initial piece that occurred. And that really, I think, caught the attention of the director community to really try to understand that different expectation that was being put on directors' behaviour during periods of crisis, and the transparency that you needed to give investors about how you were thinking about these things. So it's become so much more than just the financial.
So thank you for that, Diane. And Louise, your response to that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that's an accurate reflection, Diane, of the change in expectations I think, though, that there has always been an expectation that the board ultimately carries the accountability and the responsibility, but perhaps some of the ESG issues are calling out that nuance more clearly. I mean, I think you also saw a similar situation with Rio Tinto, where the board, the view of the board's view about what was an appropriate level of accountability to demonstrate was not in line with what investors saw was an appropriate level of accountability. So the board thought that, you know, the reduction in bonuses for some of the executives involved was demonstrating appropriate accountability, and investors, and I guess, you know, society more broadly, did not agree with that. So, and again, it was really the board's response rather than, you know, in the AMP case, for example, rather than just what transpired at the organisation that caused much greater level of focus than would have otherwise occurred.
So Louise, thank you for raising the Rio Tinto example, because one of the questions that's come up in the chat box is on the Rio board and the engagement priorities around the Juukan Gorge and the cave demolition. And I'd like to ask Angus if he could respond to this question, because it gives you the opportunity to talk about the voice of the stakeholder research that the AICD did. The key question related to Rio Tinto is, should directors be thinking more about their obligations to broader stakeholders beyond just investors? And Angus, it sounds like right up your alley, given the AICD report that was released not so long ago.
Thanks, Jackie. Well, indeed, it's a great question, because it's a very important philosophical approach that we take, and we should take, particularly in the Australian legal environment. You need to consider all your stakeholders when you're formulating your strategy, when you're formulating your approach to the market, when you're deciding what to do, because in the end, your obligation under Australian law is to act in the best interests of your organization. So we don't have an American framing that has a much greater emphasis on shareholder primacy. We have a broader framing that I think, in fact, is tremendously effective here for a host of reasons. Makes us more responsive, gives us the latitude to listen to that wide group of stakeholders, and to do that in a formal, transparent way that allows people to understand the level of communication that's taking place and the decisions that are taking place, and the context for those decisions. I mean, as we did publish that guide, you've referred to it, it's worth a read, Elevating a Stakeholder Voice to the Boardroom. It emphasizes, and David Gonski says it very neatly, he says you don't always have to agree with every stakeholder you're speaking with, but it is important in your relationship to give them voice and to have that conversation, and to be clear, at least where you do have different perspectives, why you might differ. It's a matter of respect, in a sense. But ultimately, the board then has to take all those different voices, because it would be important. I mean, it's very important to call out that when you listen to all those stakeholders, you won't find a unanimous view. They'll all have different perspectives and priorities. And then the board has to compose as best it can the answer that suits the circumstances of the company.
Yeah, thank you. And it comes to that point that Diane and yourself have raised about judgment. It's hard to have judgment if you haven't actually heard all the stakeholders that you have an obligation to. Now, I hate to put you on the spot, Angus, but the next question also seems to be an AICD question, mainly because you represent not only listed non-executive directors, but also the mutual sector. And the next question is about, there seems to be a greater focus on ESG in listed companies driven by investors. Is there the same imperative for directors to discharge their duties within a mutual or co-op or the private sector? And given you're one of the panelists that cover all those sectors, I'm interested in your view for the question.
Thanks, Jackie, and thanks for calling that out. In fact, we're often called the union of directors, in the sense that we're listed, but we have many, many more not-for-profit directors in our community, and many, many more small business mutual directors in our community than we do have listed. That's
Oh, we've got Angus is
frozen.
frozen. Are you here? Oh, thanks, Angus. Yep, you froze for a moment.
The climate survey we recently undertook with our members had over 2,000 responses, and overwhelmingly, they were focused on both the risk of climate and their reaction and opportunities in climate. So there's no question that the ESG broadly and climate in particular are issues that cut across our entire community. It's not just a listed concern, it cuts across our entire community. I would say I think our listed companies probably have more resources in order to tackle the challenge. And that's one of the reasons the Institute constantly tries to refresh our work on it, working with colleagues to give the not-for-profits and small business community more tools, but it's not.
Thank you, Angus. And I'd like to now pose the next question to Diane that's come up from the audience. And it comes back to your point about needing to have breadth of knowledge and skill. And it reinforces Angus's point that you can't just rely on one person around the board table on a special interest topic. And the question is, how are boards educating non-executive directors on responsible investing? And in this person's experience, there is limited knowledge in the boardroom on that subject matter. Diane, your point about skills and needing to be across depth and breadth, I'm interested in your view.
Yeah, investing is always a tricky topic for those organisations that have to deal with it. And I think through my portfolio, CEDA has a small corpus and we have to invest that. And so it's a really interesting conversation because you look around our board table and we are a voluntary board. We're a member-based organisation, but we have a lot of economists and people that have had very storied business careers. And, you would think, oh, well, they'll just all leap in and know how to do this. And in fact, what we did is what a sensible board does. We set up a committee that's responsible for determining how we will determine a mandate for our investing, and then how we will use an outside expert and what's the appropriate level of hindsight, which we now do through our audit and risk committee. The tricky thing with responsible investing is I think that we know that there are many investment funds that will talk about their green credentials, but when you scrape your fingernails a little bit through the veneer, it's perhaps not as green as it actually looks. So I think directors are really actually, generally alert to the fact that investing is something that is a special nature. You'll see investment committees, quite often held, and one of my other boards is a not-for-profit. And I would say, actually, I think not-for-profits and mutuals do a great deal more, particularly if you're member-based organisations, on ESG, because first off, you've got to find out what's important to your members, and that will bring that whole stakeholder lens in. But there, it's an insurance company, a private health insurer, so it has, a very large amount of funds to invest. And so there is an investment committee, and it has some main board representation on it, but also an external chair, who's a real expert in the field, but then using a number of different stimuli. And there we have found it, quite difficult to find exactly the right places to place our funds. So I think partly it's because responsible investing is still in many ways nascent and emerging. Yeah. But I do think directors are alert to the issue, responding to it in appropriate ways. But I think we're going to see real acceleration of this over the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you, Diana. What you allude to of the greenwashing that companies can be accused of leads to a question that's come from the audience that I'm going to pose to Louise, that says a study of 2019 ESG reports from the ASX 50 found more than half of the companies did not disclose when they failed to make progress about their objectives and targets, which comes to the point that you were raising, Diane, about reporting. If you're not really holding people to account on actually the deliverable. And does this weaken the corporate transparency? And is this responsible? Now, Louise, you spend a lot of your career looking at this very issue. So I'm very keen to have your view.
Yeah, well, of course, if people don't report on their progress or if they fudge the numbers, then that is not conducive to transparency, clearly. I mean, I guess to say, so ACSI's been undertaking a longitudinal study of ESG reporting by listed companies for about 10 years now. And I think it's fair to say that the standard of reporting on ESG risks and opportunities within companies has improved so much that it's really, really quite extraordinary. That doesn't mean there's not a long way to go. But, when we first started looking at this, a lot of companies mistook reporting on ESG issues for, their philanthropic glossy pages of their annual report that might talk about, the good works that they were doing. And in fact, often when I first started working at ACSI, which was only a bit over 6 years ago, that was still sometimes the mistake that, non-executive directors would make in conversations with ACSI when we raised the issue about ESG. That mistake would be very, very rare now. I think one of the things that is really important, though, is for there to be clarity about what needs to be reported against and how that reporting needs to take place. So TCFD is a really good example of that. Other areas where we're seeking greater consistency would be, for example, in the reporting on safety metrics, because at the moment we are concerned that some companies, that there's a lack of comparability between companies, but further to that, some companies change their metrics from year to year, which makes it very difficult as well. So I think that consistency and, really like working together across companies who have an exposure to an issue. So if it's safety, for example, working together so that companies can determine what are the really important issues for them to track. And then let's talk about making that transparent. I think that's really kind of the way forward for some of these key issues. And I think the TCFD offers quite a good, probably quite a good example of the way that really expectations on reporting that are consistent across different industries can be helpful.
Thank you. And building off your point about comparison across industries and learning across sectors, the next question is more about learning across countries. So the question is, thanks for very interesting discussion. What can Australian directors learn from a global perspective, such as the issues being tackled by directors based in Europe and the US? And I'll open that to any of the panelists, because I think you've all got experience in that area.
Well, I might just jump in from an investor perspective and just say quickly, before I hand over to the other two, that sometimes I think that there's this perception that it's just Australian super funds, perception within Australia that it's just Australian super funds who have an interest in ESG and that there's some sort of odd activist agenda being pursued. That it couldn't be further from the truth. Our members are interested in managing financial risk in their portfolios. And if you look globally, you will see investors everywhere are taking exactly the same approach, or in fact, going further, and in some jurisdictions required by regulation to be doing this work. So I think I would just say that this is a global investor movement, and it's even if we were to stop doing it in Australia, it wouldn't go away for those Australian companies that have an international exposure.
Thanks. And now, Diane, that leads to gaining your views, given the boards that you've sat on and still sit on that has that international exposure.
Look, it's very clear. You just need to open a newspaper and just think about the last few weeks. So we saw ExxonMobil have a proxy fight with engine number one managing to unseat 3 incumbent directors and put 3 directors who are, standing on a ESG platform onto ExxonMobil. We saw Shell in a court in The Hague being told that what it was doing on climate change wasn't enough. And that was very, very much an activist, investor-led approach. So these things are happening globally. We see Greta Thunberg, on the front page of magazines all the time. So we can see that this is a global movement, and boards have always been alert to this. Back in the day when we could still get on a plane and go places, boards would have a very strong education program that did involve looking outside Australia. And I think in the, bit over a decade that I've been a non-executive director, I visited China a couple of times. I've been to the US about 8 on board business. I'd been to Germany in particular to look at work that was being done there around the circular economy and climate change. But the UK has often been a place where we have looked to, because they tend to front run us on some areas. And now the EU, I think, is really taking that role over. So you see things like modern slavery, TCFD that we've talked about before, data privacy. These types of things get a lot of ventilation, and they play into stakeholder concerns. Because I think if you think about, those 3 things that I just mentioned, they're all very much on point in ESG.
Thank you. Now, Angus, there's another question that I actually am interested in your view that's come up from the audience. And it says, I think the heightened focus on ESG performance is reflective of the broadening asset ownership achieved through the growth in pension funds. And I am also going to throw to Louise on this after Angus, is with the continued expansion of tools of asset ownership, there will be a greater emphasis on broader performance measures. The question is, how can boards successfully meet the challenge of greater diversity of stakeholder perspectives and expectations? And once again, the voice of the stakeholder research that you've recently completed actually highlights some of the difficulties, but some of the opportunities.
Indeed, and I think the answer that's at the core would be the growth in superannuation is matched by their growth in capability and professionalism, right? So it's in some sense easier for boards to deal with large professional organizations who present thoughtful, formed research and say, look, this is what we're concerned with. This is what our members are concerned with. This is where we feel you need to address your efforts. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, in fact, in that dialogue as much as there is challenge. And there will be challenge because, as I say, people have different perspectives. And the board will also need to manage, the other end of the spectrum. If they're working in a local community, the needs of a local community. So they'll have the needs of large superannuation funds and the need of a local community, maybe a local government, maybe the Commonwealth government. It's how you navigate all those complex channels. But in fact, the growth in superannuation has many opportunities for boards, as much as challenges. Jacki, if I can just come back to the question you posed initially, I don't feel we've been leading the debate on these issues. Individual institutions have, like ACSI, but as a nation, I think we have been, sort of grinding away to keep up with, particularly the Europeans, in some of these issues. And it's a credit to ACSI and individual directors who've been more focused than others. But if I think, coming back to a comment you made in the previous panel about reinsurance, the European reinsurers were focused on climate change 20 years ago, doing their modeling, worrying about it, focused on it. It took ages for that really to come into play in our market. I think keeping our eyes to the horizon, listening to what's going on in the world is very, very important to our future, but it's very challenging given the structure of our economy and how our politics is working at the moment.
It's a good point. I remember around 2004, 2005, Sam Mostyn and Mike Hawker bringing Al Gore to our AGM as Insurance Australia Group. And that was quite a novel and was seen as something quite risky actually to do. But it was to your point, you know, climate change for an insurer was a very important reality. And we needed to start the conversation with our investors that were also, of course, being a demutualised organisation, had a lot of mum and dad investors. And so was a topic that they actually were raising, not only the institutional investors. Now, Louise, this point about the growing pension funds and then the greater diversity of stakeholder expectations, could you elaborate from your perspective on that?
Sure. Well, I think, I don't know, is stakeholder expectations growing in their diversity? I'm not sure that whether they are or whether there's just naturally more focus on. So I think as the superannuation pool grows, there is naturally more focus on the activities of superannuation funds as investors from their members, from civil society, from the political class, you know, so I think that's a natural thing. You would expect that. And so there's more noise, I think, around, you know, investment practices of superannuation funds. And you have, for example, our members need to have a strong engagement program with NGOs on climate risk. So, you know, all of those kinds of things are now in the mix, whereas when super funds were small and not particularly big investors in the economy, that was lesser of an issue. I mean, in terms of how do boards manage that, I think it goes a bit back to the point that Diane made early in the session about judgment. But it also goes to having boards that are truly diverse, and that includes gender diversity, but it also includes diversity of background and ways of thinking, so that you've got boards who can see things from different perspectives and bring those different perspectives to bear in the discussion on at the board table, and so that a broader group of perspectives, or, you know, range of perspectives, are being canvassed. I think that's a very important part of the work of modern boards.
Thanks. And that leads to a question that a member in the audience has asked, Louise, that I might get you to give a view and then open up to the other panelists. There have been new Chief Sustainability Officer appointments emerging across Australia, and the view of the panel of the audience says, I suspect this will be a growing trend, both as a result of corporate acknowledgement of the importance and to demonstrate commitment to ESG issues to stakeholders and investors. Do you foresee boards of the future being comprised of individuals with deeper ESG experience?
So the appointment of Chief Sustainability Officers is an interesting trend that I've been just starting to watch and see how that will play out. And I mean, I think it certainly has the potential to elevate the conversation about ESG issues, whatever the ones that are important for a particular company might be, to a much higher level. It also has the potential to be exercising greenwash. So we will watch this space and see how it plays out. And I hope it'll be the former, not the latter. In terms of boards, I mean, it's really interesting, you know, Diane's point earlier about the climate experts now sitting on the Exxon board, for example. I think that ultimately it's about having directors who have the ability to learn new things, to understand new risks, and also, to go back to my point, and I don't want to labour this too much, but it is kind of critical here, diversity of ways of thinking and position, you know, perspectives. And one thing that I think we need to really guard against in Australia, because it's a small, you know, we're a small country with a small pool of people to draw on. We need to guard against boards that have, you know, come from backgrounds or places or ways of thinking that are too similar, because that won't set us up for a good future. But I don't think that we necessarily can have a board that has one of everything on it. And it's the same really goes for technology and other issues as well. You know, boards have to know when they need to get expertise in, and they also have to know when to challenge and have systems in place that make that evident as well. I mean, I think the issue around governance systems is a really important one too, and one that boards need to be quite conscious of. I'm sure most boards of big companies are indeed conscious of that, but it's a critical issue, having systems in place so that you know when you're not getting the information that you need.
Thank you. And Diane, do you have a view?
Look, I think Louise used that analogy about technology, which I think is a really solid one, because if you look back about 15 years ago, there was a big debate going on. Does every board need to have a technology committee? Should there be a technologist sitting on every board? And if you today sit on a board and you don't understand digitisation and automation and what's going on in cybersecurity, well, frankly, you're not up to snuff, you know, and you don't deserve your seat around the board table. But there were technology committees, and there was the appointment of someone who really knew technology, was a deep technology expert. And when you have someone that comes into a board that is different to everybody else, boy, does it change things. So I was on the Wesfarmers board when Paul Bassett, who was one of the co-founders of SEEK, joined the board, and he was different to anybody else. And his experience of that startup was really different. There weren't that many successful Australian startups in that sort of space anyway. So having, you know, been able to lure Paul onto the Wesfarmers board, we made sure that we took the best, you know, that he had to teach us. And I am a very different director today for the fact that I could observe his thinking, the questions he asked, the things he thought it was important for us to dig into and get to know. So I think directors just need to grow and evolve the whole time. So I can see the Chief Sustainability Officer being super important in some organisations and being a really good construct that'll live forever. And there'll be executives who go through that experience and they'll make fantastic directors, but all directors really need to understand what are the sustainability issues for their organisation. I find the materiality matrix just so useful to actually have the debate around the board table and with management about getting that matrix right. And of course, it's never going to be 100% perfect. It's just like a risk matrix. It's never 100% perfect, but it's the conversation you have to get to a consensus point that really illuminates the understanding of the board, the gaps, and a good chairman will see that conversation happen and then curate the board education program over the next 12 months. You know, I never want to be the chairman of a board that doesn't have learning as one of its core values, you know, and I think the idea of boards having their own purpose and theme and, you know, this 12 months we're really leaning on this and we're going to come out the other end of it looking slightly different. You know, I think that's in a way, you know, becoming more accepted in boardrooms, that we really need to work very hard on our ability to continue to be the right stewards for the organisation.
Thank you. Now, Angus, your perspective on this specialist board director versus more of a generalist, and your views on the Chief Sustainability Officer then having stronger representation in a role at the board level.
I think my colleagues have covered the ground well, but I'd echo a few things. I think Louise and Diane have both spoke about cognitive diversity. I can't overemphasize that. As an economist, I can confess you can have an excess supply of economists on a board. As an example, you need people with different ways of thinking in order to be genuinely curious and to get the best from the stakeholder engagement that you're working on. If I can pick up one point that Louise made earlier about, you know, the challenges facing boards. I think one of those challenges, even though it may not be broader, may not be deeper, it is in some respects perhaps, but I think one of the challenges we have in this moment, at least, is society's looking to solve problems through corporations because the political process isn't getting there fast enough. And I think that's one of the challenges that our boards are dealing with now, whether it's equity, whether it's climate change. There are a number of big issues in society that we're struggling to resolve through the political process, and therefore corporate and not-for-profit interests are stepping in to resolve those. And that takes a different frame of mind. It takes a different approach to it. You can't possibly step in and substitute for the public policy process, but you can lean in to try to fix things that you know aren't working well.
Which goes to the point of embedding ESG or the Sustainable Development Goals as part of your strategy and your risk management, so you're getting value for the company as well as society in that leadership role. I'm aware of time and we're right on time, so I really do appreciate all the questions that we've still got that we will attempt to answer on chat. But can we join in a virtual round of applause for our panelists? It's been amazing. And as I said, I feel very privileged to have spent time being able to pose the questions from the audience to these three key experts in their own right, who are also passionate about the topic on leadership around environmental, social, and the governance questions. So thank you, each of you. Really appreciate it.